At 3:17 p.m., my plane kissed the runway with that hollow thud that rattles your ribs, and by 10 that night my family would be watching firefighters carry me out of my own house on the evening news. If you've ever reached for your people and felt your hand close on air, tell me where you're watching from. Tap like, hit subscribe, and pull up a chair, because this is how a perfect life cracked, how silence almost killed me, and how the fallout became the loudest revenge I never planned. Before grief redrew every line of my life, I lived one of those postcard existences people scroll past with envy. My name is Lila Hart. I'm 35, and until 6 months ago, I believed I had the kind of marriage that could weather anything. My husband, Evan, had a laugh that lived in his chest and came out in ripples. We met sophomore year when he found my annotated library book and hunted me down to return it. He said he couldn't stand the idea of my color-coded notes being lost to the void. It should have been creepy. It was disarming instead. He bought me tea, asked 100 questions, remembered the names of my roommates, and walked me back to my dorm through the first snow of the season, our footprints knitting a path behind us. 10 years later, we had a two-story in Minneapolis, the kind with a porch swing that knew our every secret and a backyard I filled with peonies and zinnias that exploded each June. I worked as a marketing director. He built software so clean you could run your fingertips down the logic and never snag. Thursday nights were board games with friends. Sundays were slow walks by the river. We saved and schemed and circled baby names in the margins of grocery lists. We turned the spare room into a home office with paint the color of morning soft and full of promise, because we were sure it would become a nursery soon. Then came the email from Lisbon. A European tech company wanted Evan for a 6-month contract in Portugal, all sun-washed tiles and big-brained projects. It was the sort of offer you say yes to before you figure out the logistics. I arranged to work remotely in chunks, planning to be there for part of it, and we laughed at the idea of us as temporary expats, Evan learning to order pastries in Portuguese, me filming those pastel pink sunsets to send home. On his last night stateside, we cooked together, our elbows bumping as we burned garlic bread and didn't care. We ate in the good dining room we reserved for holidays and important conversations. 6 months, he promised, threading our fingers. Blink. We did everything right. Daily video calls. My 3-week visit around the holidays that felt like a second honeymoon. We wandered Alfama's narrow streets and got lost on purpose. He pointed out the office window that framed the ocean and teased me for how many photos I took of laundry lines. The future looked bright enough to squint against. The morning everything fractured, he logged onto our call pinching the bridge of his nose. Weird headache, he said. Writer's block for programmers. He chuckled and waved me off. 8 hours later, his coworker's number lit up my screen. When I answered, a stranger's voice had to learn how to say my name. They said aneurysm. They said rupture. They said we are doing everything. I booked the next flight anyway. By the time I ran into the hospital in Lisbon, breathless and bargaining with any god that would have me, Evan was on a ventilator. A lullaby of machines filled the room. Doctors listed options, none of them choices. I held his hand for 5 days and fed him every story from our life like it might coax him back. The time we set off the smoke alarm with a failed creme brulee, the way he always left 2 bites of dessert for me without mentioning it, how he slept with his hand on the pillow where I was supposed to be when he traveled. They warmed his room, cooled it, swabbed, scanned, hoped. And then hope shrank to a pinprick and blinked out. People talk about paperwork like it's a chore. No one tells you how violent it feels to spell your husband's name over and over under the word deceased in a language you don't speak, your mouth dry from repeating the one fact your body refuses to accept. The hospital social worker moved fragile kindnesses into my days, an interpreter with soft eyes, a chair that reclined so I could fail at sleeping, a list of funeral homes I could barely look at. Bringing Evan home would have cost more than the mortgage we'd paid for 6 years. I made a decision I still taste like salt when I think about it. He would be laid to rest there, under a sky that had held our happiest weeks. I called my family every day from across an ocean hoping that grief might finally thaw something in them. If you've ever been the reliable child, you know the choreography. You keep your voice calm so no one has to manage your feelings. You apologize for needing anything. You cheerlead other people's news while yours sits like a stone. My mother, Ruth, asked if I'd bought travel insurance. My brother, Blake, said he had a big pitch and could send vibes. My father, Gerald, murmured, "Hang in there, kiddo," like I was stuck in traffic, not bricked up in a hospital room counting breaths I couldn't keep. The funeral was small, a handful of Evan's colleagues, two expats who had eaten lunch with us once and showed up like old friends, a priest with a voice like velvet and a name I can't remember. I stood alone at the grave and tucked a eucalyptus in the fresh dirt because it felt like a prayer. "I'll carry you," I promised. "I'll carry you." After, Lisbon became a scavenger hunt of stamps and seals. Death certificates needed to be authenticated at 3 different offices, each across the city from the last. I sweat through dresses and learned the Portuguese words for again and please and thank you, and I am trying. I collected his watch, his favorite paperbacks warped with this winter's humidity, the shells we pocketed at Cascais. I carried everything the way you cradle an infant's head, carefully, terrified of dropping anything important. When the logistics were finally done, I booked my return. 30 hours, 3 flights, one body that felt like it had been emptied and refilled with sand. As we taxied toward the gate in Minneapolis, I opened our family group chat and typed, landing 5:05 p.m. "Can someone swing by?" It was the kind of ask you shouldn't have to word gently. Blake answered almost immediately. "Swamped. Grab a lift." My mother chimed in. "Why didn't you arrange this earlier?" My father added a thumbs up emoji and drive safe. My thumb hovered over the keyboard long enough to sting. I texted, "It's fine. I'll manage," and pretended the words didn't slice on their way out. The airport fluorescents were cruel to anyone who hadn't slept. Customs blurred. Baggage claims fun. I waited for 3 suitcases, 1 with my life, 2 with Evan's. When the last one tumbled down the chute, the wheel on my cart jammed. The top case pitched forward, popped open, and spilled his shirts onto the polished floor like a magician's trick. Navy button-down. Charcoal sweater. The ridiculous pineapple swim trunks I hated and loved. I dropped to my knees and grabbed fabric with shaking hands that didn't feel attached to me. "Hey," a soft voice. An airport employee in a bright vest crouched beside me, name tag Gloria catching the light. "Let me help," she said, already folding the sweater along the crease lines of someone who understood that ritual sometimes holds you together. "Are you okay?" No one had asked me that. Not in a way that waited for an answer. "My husband died," I said, the words oddly polite. "I buried him in Portugal. Today." She didn't gasp or rush some solution into the quiet. She packed the case, snapped it shut, wheeled my cart across the terminal like a friend, and waited until my rideshare pulled up. "Take care of yourself," she said, squeezing my hand, and it undid me more than anything my family had texted. The driver, Paul, a grandfatherly man who smelled like spearmint, talked to fill the silence without poking at it. He pointed out the new mural under the bridge and how the city had changed while I was gone. The ride cost more than I wanted to think about in rush hour surge pricing. He hauled my luggage to the porch anyway. "You sure someone's inside?" he asked. I lied and said yes. The house met me like a held breath. Cold air rolled out the moment I opened the door. Someone had promised to set the thermostat and pick up the mail. No one had. Envelopes sagged over the basket. The kitchen was a science experiment gone wrong. I opened the fridge and closed it just as fast. Upstairs, our bedroom waited untouched. The bedspread smooth. Evan's favorite flannel still on the hook where he left it the morning he flew out, as if it might warm up in his absence. His closet door hung open, neat rows of shirts like a prayer flag line. I pressed my face to the fabric and inhaled like I could find him in the fibers. Clean cotton. Dust. A memory of cedar. I slept curled in the armchair by the window because the bed felt too alive with the shape of us. I woke to a sound I couldn't place, like a faucet left on but meaner. By the time I got downstairs, the sound had a body. Water sheeted from a seam in the kitchen ceiling. It drummed onto tile, sluiced across the floor, crept under the dining room hardwood where it made the boards bow like a submarine hull. I waded to the utility closet and turned the main shut off with numb fingers until the flow stuttered and died, but the damage had already spread out and taken root. My breath came white from my mouth. The storm everyone had been talking about had arrived with teeth. If the heat had been on, the pipes wouldn't have frozen. I told myself this like a fact and not a verdict. I called every emergency plumber on the first page of search results. The ones who answered spoke in that winter voice, apologetic, exhausted. "It's the whole city," one dispatcher said. "Earliest we can do is Tuesday." I dialed Blake. He picked up on the fourth ring. "Hey, I'm running out the door," he said over the sound of clattering dishes. "We've got clients coming." "My kitchen is a waterfall," I said. "And the heat's off. I can't stay here." "That's rough," he said, and I could hear him not listening. "Try a few more companies? Or there's that handyman site, TaskRabbit? Also, the roads are getting bad. Can I stay with you and Lisa tonight?" I asked. "Just for a night. I'm still jet-lagged." Pause. "Guest rooms full of craft stuff. We've been reorganizing. And, clients. Did you call Mom?" I did. Ruth answered in the bright voice she uses when company is over. "Oh, sweetheart. If only you'd said something sooner. Bridge Club meets here tomorrow and the table is set. Your father twisted his back carrying chairs in from the garage. The house is a mess. Hotel? Your insurance should cover it." I was so cold my teeth tapped like a metronome, but I still thanked her. Then, because grief is weird and stubborn, I tried to fix one more thing. The basement steps were slick. I held the railing like a lifeline, phone flashlight biting a narrow tunnel through the dim. Water lapped at my ankles. I stepped toward the electrical panel because survival turns you into someone brave or foolish, and sometimes they're the same. My foot slid. I reached out. Metal met palm. The world stepped sideways. Electricity flung me back hard enough that my skull rang. When I came up through the dark, my right arm was needles and fire. Something warm ran into my eyebrow and down my cheek. I thought of Evan saying blink and technically obeyed. I crawled to the stairs. Each step was a mountain. By the time I reached the living room, my body shook with that deep cold you can't muscle through. I sank onto the sofa because there was nowhere else to go. The house made a noise I didn't understand at first, a piercing, insistent beeping that didn't belong to any kitchen timer. Carbon monoxide. It cut through the fog. My phone lay on the coffee table, inches beyond the reach of my hand that wouldn't grip. I stretched until the edges of the room feathered, and the beeping became the only sound that mattered. I thought about how petty it would be to die because I couldn't pick up my phone. I thought about how oddly peaceful it felt to imagine Evan in a place where the air was warm and never ran out. I thought the stupidest thought of my life. At least this would spare me the bills. I almost missed the pounding on the front door. Someone shouting my name from far away. Then the whine of sirens sliding toward me like rope. Later, between oxygen masks and heated blankets and a doctor's penlight interrogating my pupils, I learned the plot twist that saved me. Yolanda Ortiz, who has lived across the street since before we moved in, looked up from her second cup of coffee and saw water streaming under my front door like the house was crying. She called. She pounded. She pressed her ear to the wood and heard the CO alarm and didn't waste a second more. She called 911 and stood on my icy steps motioning firefighters like she was ushering in spring. At North River Medical Center, I was a checklist of bad ideas. Moderate hypothermia, a concussion, an electrical burn, and carbon monoxide levels that made a nurse suck air between her teeth. They strapped a hot air blower to my feet and slid warm 4 fluids into my veins like apology. A nurse, Sanaa, with a braid that reached the middle of her back, cleaned the gash above my eyebrow with gentle hands and a kindness that made my throat ache. "You're safe," she said, and I didn't know how to believe her yet, but I wanted to. I told her everything in broken pieces, the flights, the grave, the empty house that was supposed to be a landing and wasn't. She wrote the shape of it in my chart because she was worried about sending me home to a place and people who didn't know how to hold me. Down the hall, a reporter named Kaylin Gwynn had come to cover storm injuries and heard a paramedic say the phrase "newly widowed." It's a phrase that holds a whole world inside it. She followed the thread. She interviewed Yolanda, who said, "I thought she was sleeping off the jet lag," and cried into her scarf anyway. She spoke to the paramedics who'd carried me out under a sky hard with cold. One of them, young, freckled, with eyelashes I would have hated him for if I'd had the energy, mentioned that when they found me, my phone was open to a family group chat. He didn't read it to the camera. He couldn't, legally. But he described the vibe. I had asked for a ride after 30 hours of travel and gotten logistics in response. Try a rideshare, should have planned ahead, drive safe. It was a little domestic vignette with teeth. By the 10 o'clock broadcast, the story had a lower third banner you could think was melodramatic until you saw the footage. Woman returns from husband's overseas funeral, rescued from freezing, flooded home. Streets snow-glowed blue in the ambulance lights. My porch looked small and scared. The anchor read a line about neighbors, community, and timing. Kayla said my name and didn't make it sound like pity. In living rooms across the city, people clutched their mugs a little tighter. In one living room, my family forgot how to breathe. I learned this from Sanaa, who watched them pour down the hallway an hour later. Blake came first, his face the color of copy paper. "We saw the piece," he blurted when he reached my bed. This is totally out of context. He tried to smile like there was some version of the story where he didn't look exactly like who he'd been. My mother swept into the room with her church luncheon graciousness turned up to 11. What a misunderstanding. She told the nurse before she told me anything. We had no idea her house was in such a state. My father lingered by the window, counted tiles, and said to me quietly, "You're all right." It was the first useful sentence. My phone started vibrating like a live thing. Extended family. Family friends. My aunt, demanding to know if the news had really said what it said. My dad's boss offering help that felt like a bomb and a bruise all at once. In the hallway outside my room, my family's whispers knifed through the white noise machine. Damage control. Optics. How to fix this? Not one person used the word sorry in the ways that matter. The hospital social worker, Mira Patel, arrived after breakfast with paperwork and options. "The community is responding," she said with a small smile that looked like hope. A plumbing company had offered to fix the pipes for free. A restoration crew would start the next morning. A hotel had donated a 2-week stay. A meal service wanted to deliver dinners, so I didn't have to think about forks. My mother pressed 2 fingers into her chest. "We are taking her home with us," she announced to Dr. Reynolds, who had come to talk concussion protocols and what carbon monoxide does to your brain. "Of course we are. Family first. DR." Reynolds didn't look at her. He looked at me. "Who do you want to be with?" he asked. "For your brain to heal, you need warmth, steady food, quiet, and low stress. Not for a day, for weeks." He waited. Sanaa tightened the blood pressure cuff around my arm like she was reminding me where I ended and the world began. "There are alternatives," she murmured without looking away from the monitor. "If you want them." My mother's mouth pinched. "Alternatives," she repeated like the word tasted bad. "She's coming home with her family." I thought about the cold in my bones. I thought about how Riley, the furnace tech from North Star Mechanical, would be in my kitchen tomorrow because strangers had seen my name crawl across a screen and decided to show up. I thought about Yolanda on my steps calling my name. "I'd like to hear the alternatives," I said. The room stilled the way rooms do before storms. "Amelia," my mother started, catching herself because she'd used my childhood name and not the one I chose at 20 to celebrate the woman I was becoming. "Lila," she corrected, and the correction was the last kindness she offered that day. "Don't be dramatic." "What exactly," I asked quietly, "have you done that entitles you to decide anything?" Once the words were out, they made space for more. "When Evan was dying, you were too busy to fly. When I buried him alone, tickets were too expensive. When I landed after 30 hours, you were busy. When my house flooded, you had bridge. When I asked for help, I got plan better." Blake held up his hands like a crossing guard. "Okay, that is unfair," he said. "You never said it was that bad." "You never asked," I answered. "Not once did you ask, 'How are you?' Not once did you say, 'We're coming.'" My father, to his credit, looked like someone who had been dropped into a play mid-scene and realized he'd been performing the wrong script for decades. "Grief makes all of this. Big," he offered. "Grief makes this clear," I said. I've been rationing myself my entire life, so you'll keep me. I'm done doing that to survive. Mira laid out the alternatives like a table I could sit at without apologizing. The Cetaline Hotel had a warm room and a bed that didn't remember me almost dying on it. The plumbing and restoration companies would text updates, so I didn't have to walk into more surprises. A grief group met Tuesday and Thursday evenings and had already saved me a chair. Neighbors had emailed to volunteer tangible help, rides to appointments, a pot of chili, someone to water the plants I'd neglected since the first snow. Blake sputtered. "You're picking strangers over us?" "I'm picking kindness over image," I said. "I'm picking practical help over excuses. I'm picking not dying alone on a sofa again." My mother gripped her handbag until her knuckles went white. "When you come to your senses," she said, "we'll be here." She meant when cameras aren't. "That's the thing," I said. "You never were." They filed out in slow, insulted procession. My father hesitated, then followed, leaving the air softer behind them. Sanaa tucked the blanket tighter around my shoulders. "That," she said, "was the hardest thing." She didn't mean the pipe, the shock, the ICU. She meant the sentence you say to yourself that moves the world. The city held me up like hands. The Cetaline room smelled like peace. The bed was an apology and a promise. Someone had stocked the mini fridge with yogurt and juice and a typewritten note. "We're glad you're here." Jazz at the front desk. The plumbing crew texted a photo of the shutoff fixed and labeled so clearly even grief could find it. The restoration team sent before and afters that hurt to look at but soothed something in me anyway. On Tuesday night, I sat in a circle at the community center with 8 people whose eyes recognized mine and said our dead ones' names out loud so they stopped being something we swallowed. And the city kept coming. A bakery down the block sent bread. A yoga studio offered gentle classes. The barista who'd made Evan roll his eyes at my complicated coffee order started pouring mine without asking and never charged me once. Yolanda brought pozole and sat at my table telling me stories about Evan snowblowing her sidewalk before the first storm every year because he liked to be prepared, and we laughed hard enough to scare the dust back into the corners. The news story sprouted legs. A screenshot from the broadcast, ambulance lights painting the snow, my porch light flickering like a heartbeat, got shared and shared again. Someone wrote hashtag "I'll figure it out" under it in that internet voice that makes a joke out of a tragedy to keep from screaming. The tag traveled. People used it to talk about the time they drove themselves to the ER while their brother texted busy. People used it to say they'd found family and neighbors, coworkers, strangers with jumper cables. None of this was revenge in the cinematic sense. There were no screaming confrontations in parking lots. No grand speeches delivered at funerals. But reputation can be a thin glass wall. All it takes is one thrown stone of truth and the whole thing becomes a cathedral of sound. My parents' bridge club called. Blake's clients canceled and then rescheduled with a side of "we hope your sister is okay" that tasted a lot like we saw. They had spent a lifetime choreographing a picture of competence and closeness. The city had seen the edges where the tape lifted. Weeks blurred into something gentler. My concussion receded like a tide. My right palm healed pink and smooth. The scar above my eyebrow faded to a silver comma that made me look like a story mid-sentence. The restoration team not only put my house back the way it had been, they made it better. A smart thermostat I could adjust from my phone, a water sensor under the sink that chirped before a leak became a flood, a new hot water heater that hummed like a cat. I cried when the heat kicked on the first time, not because of warmth, but because I hadn't done it alone. The boundary I set in that hospital room became a line I painted fresh every morning. My mother texted a picture of a casserole she'd taken to a church friend and thinking of you underneath. I sent a heart and no other words. Blake called once to say his clients had misinterpreted the news piece and that social media was a nightmare. I told him I hoped his next pitch went better and I meant it. My father emailed a link about home insurance riders and used "Love, Dad" as a signature. I read it twice. One night, when the house felt like it might be mine again, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote the first lines of something I hadn't known I'd carry out of all this: the Evan Hart Memorial Fellowship for Study Abroad. If there had been a fund for emergency travel, I wouldn't have had to choose between money and mourning. If there had been a checklist for what to do in a foreign hospital when you are the only family, maybe some bureaucrat would have stamped a paper faster because a piece of it had Evan's name on it. I took the life insurance payout, the one I would have set on fire to have him back, and turned it into a promise with teeth: flights for families, contingency funds when plans explode, a hotline for parents who don't know which office door to knock on in a city that isn't theirs. On the first anniversary of our wedding under a certain kind of blue sky, I invited the people who had stood in the gap for me to my living room. Yolanda brought a flan. Sana came in a dress that made the room look expensive. The restoration team tracked mud on the rug and apologized, and I told them to hush because I like the proof of a life that's been lived. We gave the first fellowship to Angel, a junior with a grin like sunrise who wanted to study in Kyoto and whose mother squeezed my hand until our bones almost remembered being the same. I said Evan's name into the air and felt it land on the furnace hum and the peony bush outside and the left-behind quiet of this strange bright life. A week later, a letter found my mailbox, actual paper, my father's handwriting on the envelope. Inside, words I'd never seen from him, not even when I was 9 and broke my wrist falling off the jungle gym, and he gave me an ice cream instead of a proper apology for missing the recital. He wrote about the broadcast and the ache and the way he'd stood at our kitchen window and watched snow tunnels between houses. He wrote, "I don't have an excuse." I had a script I thought was love, and it turns out it was obligation with good lighting. I don't deserve a second chance. If you're open, I'd like a first honest one. He suggested coffee every other Wednesday at the diner by the river. He said nothing about my mother or Blake, and for the first time I recognized that he and I had been performing in different plays all along. I took a week to decide. I talked to Mira about grief and boundaries, and how sometimes a small door opens where a wall used to be. Then I said yes with conditions that wouldn't make TV, no holidays. No pretending. We talk about weather only until we don't. He wrote back deal. We drank coffee that first Wednesday like we were interviewing to be in each other's lives, which is exactly what we were. On the third Wednesday, he said Evan was better than I gave him credit for, and I said me too, and we sat with it. Blake sent a slick holiday card that could have been generated by a gratitude robot. My mother left a voicemail in March to say she'd love to help with the garden this spring in a voice that meant other people will see me helping. I planted zinnias by myself and let the dirt under my nails be the only proof anyone needed. A year after Lisbon, I packed a small suitcase, book, scarf, the eucalyptus I'd dried from that day, and stood at the gate for a flight back to Portugal to visit Evan's grave. The airport smelled like cinnamon rolls and jet fuel and new beginnings. A mom tried to wrangle a toddler into a hoodie 2 sizes too small. A teenager filmed a TikTok. A man fell asleep face down on his backpack. The announcements chimed, and for the first time the sound didn't spark an animal panic under my skin. I thought about the woman who had flown home last year and almost died because the people she'd called family didn't know how to show up. I thought about the woman who is boarding now, whose circle had widened to include a nurse who still texts, a neighbor who brings Pozole every time the barometer drops, a hotel clerk who cried when I checked out because she'd built me a little altar out of yogurt cups and post-it notes and wanted to be sure I had everything. The lesson wasn't that my family are villains. They're humans with brittle places who chose their comfort over my crisis one too many times. The lesson is this. You can stop asking empty wells for water. You can build a life where showing up is the only currency that spends. You can be the kind of person who sees water bleeding under a door and knocks like salvation. When people ask where the revenge is, because for some reason we always want a villain licking their wounds in Act 3, I tell them it looks like this. Reputations cracking where truth finds them. Invitations drying up. Phone calls being picked up with, "Did you see?" The story you tell about yourself getting interrupted by the one other people watched on the news. I didn't plot vengeance. I planted a flag. The city noticed. That was enough. If you've been abandoned at the moment your bones turn to glass, hear me, your worth isn't contingent on someone else's ability to recognize it. Family is not an automatic membership. Sometimes your real people show up in bright vests at baggage claim, in scrubs at 2 a.m., with hot soup and a spare space heater. The hardest part is not dying on the sofa of other people's comfort while you ask politely to be seen. What surprised kindness have you found when your first calls went unanswered? Drop it in the comments. I'm reading every single one. If this story found you at the right time, like, subscribe, share it with the friend who needs permission to draw a line. Love doesn't keep score, but it does keep promises. Mine kept me here. And from here, I can carry him and myself forward.